Good afternoon. My name is Perrotta, a corporate attorney with the Cannabis Legal Group here in downtown Royal Oak, Michigan. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Patricia Myers, who's also a corporate attorney with the Cannabis Legal Group. Our discussion today will focus about caregiver and caregiver operations and really the downward negative pressure that caregivers are facing in the state throughout various municipalities. And then we'll talk about some options that caregivers can avail themselves to potentially get away from those downward pressures and possibly transition into a licensed grow facility, and potentially even another license type that was just made available to not only caregivers but other individuals and entities here in the state of Michigan. So without further ado, I'll let Patricia dive into some of the background regarding caregiver operations and the downward pressure that we discussed, and then we'll circle back regarding those new license types and have those discussions as well.
Thanks, Andre. Right now, the current climate for caregivers, and when I say caregivers, I'm going to separate the individual who, by themselves has their own caregiving just for themselves and not for other people. We're really talking about a caregiver that has patients, and in that case, you're trying to serve your patients, but there is a lot of pressure right now. We're seeing it on a regular basis, and it is building, with municipalities really bringing all their resources to bear to investigate any complaints, to have any safety issues that they're concerned about looked into. They will involve various departments within the municipality, which before, usually it might be just the building code department. In this case, it'll be the fire department involved as well. And sometimes the prosecutor's office gets involved too if they need to take action. So one of the areas that is a hot topic right now, especially within municipalities, is fire safety. There's a lot of concern that the added electricity that's being used, if things aren't properly permitted or set up, sometimes they can have impromptu investigations of the property without going inside. They can sort of see what's going on based upon your activity with DTE. So just some things to consider. Clients are experiencing difficulties because they might have somebody show up on their property when they're not there, or they could be there, and they actually shut down the electricity because it doesn't have the proper permits. Maybe it does, maybe they've made a mistake, but they're being overly cautious right now. And that is really kind of the mindset that the municipalities are taking, as safety first and involving pretty much every department they can in enforcing it. And the prosecution department, they will come into play too if it gets to that point. That has increased the pressure on caregivers to not only just be in compliance, but also to be concerned about a municipality over-regulating or getting overly involved when in fact you are compliant.
Another way that there's this downward pressure, not only at the state level, but also on the municipal level, as you mentioned, some of these municipalities are changing some of their zoning ordinances and zoning classifications to make it almost nearly impossible to operate a compliant caregiver operation. And so the lay of the land is such, if we kind of try to see where this is going, it's really yielding towards a state that is trying to eliminate, for lack of a better term, caregiver operations. They're trying to push it more towards the licensed grow facility market, but there is a need for caregivers because there are patients in the state that rely on the work of caregivers. But as Patricia is alluding to, there is this downward pressure both on the state and even the local level, from the fire department to the building codes to even the prosecutor's office, to make sure that caregivers are in full compliance, because they really are under the gun, for lack of a better term.
As Andre said, we want to make sure that these caregiving operations don't go away, that medical caregivers can still do business, take care of their patients, take care of themselves. And in this particular kind of climate, the way to go about it, there are some new options and some new products. But before we get there, I also want to stress that with regard to one other element that seems to be very predominant out there as far as putting pressure on caregivers, has to do with the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association, and we'll say the MCMA for short.
Right.
And that's a lobbyist organization, a very big, effective and strong lobbyist. And their goal is to add more regulation as much as they can, basically, and the reason that is purported is for public safety. Now, the burden of additional regulation will fall on the caregivers more than anybody else, because caregivers are independent. They operate in a manner that is not organized. And your group, you have your patients, and you're just trying to go about your business, but you are going to be overburdened with regulations that aren't necessary, and complying with those takes financial resources that caregivers can't afford. So effectively, when the lobbyist group goes forward and pushes for more and more public safety regulations that are unnecessary, it will negatively affect the caregiving operations to the point where they just can't afford it. And that's one more way that we are noticing that caregiving is really sort of being moved out, phased out.
There is a phase out.
Exactly. And so we don't want that to happen. So there are options here to go in that direction. And, caregiving is, it's a great portion of the groups that actually provide marijuana in the state of Michigan. And I think that's really why the lobbyist group is focused on them, because caregiving is really a large portion of the market.
Exactly right. As Patricia mentioned too, there is the MCMA is providing this pressure to effectively phase out the caregivers. So as we both alluded to, they're under increased pressure to show that they're in complete compliance with all applicable regulations and laws governing their operations as caregivers. But if caregivers, we mentioned at the beginning, if they want to get out of caregiving and get out of the costly compliance areas that are now required of them, one way to get out of that is to apply for a various license type, a grow license, various grow licenses, whether Class A, B, or C. But interestingly, a new law was passed, a new regulation was passed that allows a new different type of micro-business license in the state of Michigan that particularly we feel may be of interest to caregivers, especially caregivers who want to go into the licensed facility operations. That new license type is called a micro-business Class A license. The benefit of that is under a general micro-business license, the owner, the operator, is only allowed to grow 150 plants. So that's really not a lot of plants. It's not a lot of product really to keep their shelves stocked to meet the demand of the product. So the new law, which establishes again a Class A microbusiness, doubles that cap. It caps it now at 300. So you're now able to double your biomass effectively. And it also allows you to get other material from outside sources. It allows you to buy and sell product with other licensed facilities, whereas there was only a one-time exception under the caregiver laws. Yep. It also allows you to get processed material from licensed processors. So you can have, for example, tinctures and vape cartridges and vape pens on your shelves, even though those weren't made at your micro-business facility. Right. So that's a new license type that is just becoming on board, and it may be of particular interest to these caregivers who, again, are under the gun, under a lot of stress for compliance and regulatory compliance concerns, who may say, I certainly enjoy it, and I loves, sorry for cutting that. So certain caregivers could find this appealing because while they may enjoy providing the needed cannabis to their medical patients, this may allow them to come away from, out under the shadows, so to speak, and really go into the licensed field to become a licensed operating facility. Which some of the regulations are more are easier to follow in terms of being less ambiguous in terms of state and local authorities coming at and digging around your operations.
And Andre, you're exactly right, because basically what we're looking at is if you're a caregiver with patients and you're going to be subject to the extent and regulated to the extent that licensed entities are, why not have those additional perks?
Correct.
And that additional ability to function within the market.
Exactly. And again, the regulations for licensed facilities are much more clear than the regulations are for caregivers. That really, the enforcement as well. As Patricia mentioned earlier, sometimes the enforcement, there's choice really about prosecutors. They choose who to go after. The regulations are more clearly defined for licensed facilities. And this microbusiness Class A type of microbusiness license again, is particularly appealing to some of the caregiver clients we have and have addressed this issue with.
Yes. So that's the direction we're going in right now. We really see that the caregiving will be phased out. And the way it's really being instituted is by adding all of the regulations that are out there right on top of the caregiver that are applicable to all of the licensed businesses. So why not have the perks of the licensed business? Because it's easier than ever now, especially under the new rules. The options are greater. The transition is much easier.
Correct.
You have the experience growing, so it's a good time.
Exactly right. To Patricia's point, I mean, a lot of the caregiver clients that we represent do express this anxiety of where the future or what the future holds. And while we do sense that caregiver operations are being phased out, it's not a death knell, so to speak, because there are options available. Whether you still want to maintain the caregiver operations or want to transition into a fully licensed grower or other type of license that is allowed in the state of Michigan. And so again, we hope you found today's discussion about caregivers and various license types for potential transitioning from caregivers helpful. And if you would like additional information regarding this topic or any other topic regarding cannabis licensing, feel free to visit our website at cannabis-legalgroup.com or email us at andre@cannabis-legalgroup.com or Patricia.
And I can be reached at patricia@cannabis-legalgroup.com. We welcome emails and we'll get back to you right away. Thank you.
Thanks.